定期的にしっかり瞑想する必要がある。一滴の雨では喉の渇きは癒せないからな。また試したいか？
いくらかかるの？
それは自分で決めてくれ。
こんなところ。
よし、瞑想している間見守ってやろう。
Alright. You know, the moon has its own rise and fall and set as well. Goes on its own little journey across the sky. But yeah, as nice as science is, it does have its limitations, and I would like to explore some of that with you all. So, one of the things the book says is that you can't use science to answer ethical questions. And I think that's very an interesting and bold claim to make. But it's something that if we just accepted from the text, well, we would just be committing, what is that, appeal to authority, right? So let's try it out, right? What would it be like to actually try and research ethical questions in the form of empirical scientific questions? Could we use the scientific method to answer an ethical question? So, if you've done the survey asking you about the Triassic Park experience and who would you save, you probably have some idea what I'm referring to here, but I'm going to use a different example just here in this video that gets to the same idea. Okay, so we ask a simple question, but we ask it many times. Who gets to live? How do you determine which lives must be saved and which are acceptable losses? In order to do so, you're going to have to make some kind of values judgment. You're going to have to say, this is what is important, and this is what we should focus on when making this kind of decision in order to answer this ethical question. So, okay, let's try and figure out how we would answer that empirically. Would you do a survey? Would you just get a bunch of people together and say, hey, who do you think should live or die in an apocalypse situation? People are going to have different things that they feel as important, and just getting people's opinions is not going to satisfy this question. So maybe you do an experiment, right? Let's say you actually put someone in that situation to see how they would respond, right? Let's say you sit people down and you tell them, hey, the person on the other side of this room is a criminal, and we need to get them to confess to this crime. I need you to administer a small series of shocks to them. And, you know, eventually they'll reach a threshold where they will reveal their information. Or we could go with a real life example of, you know, you sit people down and you tell them, this is just part of an experiment. You're just going to administer some series of shocks to this other person. It's perfectly fine. They're harmless. You know, don't even worry about it. And then the researcher slowly but surely pushes the person to go further and further with the intensity of the shocks until at a certain point the person on the other side is pleading, hey, please, I have a heart condition, don't keep shocking me. And yet the experimenter tells them, no, you have to keep going, continue with the higher voltage, follow the rules, do what I tell you to do, and people comply to the point where they continue to administer the shocks even after the person on the other side of the room has clearly gone unconscious. At least this is what's perceived, because this is actually fake, but to the person in the experiment, facing the experiment, they're actually carrying this out. And you figure out that 30% of your population, the people that you serve, or the people in your experiment, 30% of them would go all the way. They would kill someone if instructed to do so. This is average, everyday people, as supposedly a representative group of your population, and you carry this study out all across the world, and you see 30%, 40% of people do this. Does that still answer the question on what the right thing to do is ethically? But you know what? Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about love, right? They say what you won't do, you do for love. You know, maybe we can answer some sort of ethical questions with research, you know? Maybe our intentions or maybe our intuitions are right sometime, like, should you or should you not cheat, right? That's maybe something we could come up with, like a some kind of ethical research experiment of how you would answer that, you know, whether people should do that or not. I think they made a TV show about it at some point. But let's just try and think through some different ways in which something could be true or it could not be true, right? So we'll give a statement. This is from your textbook, page 19, if you want to practice some of the other examples. But it says, you cannot truly love another person unless you love yourself. True or false? You probably got a gut feeling about that, right? I don't know of any research on that because I feel like trying to operationalize love is a nightmare. And you know what? I guess I should explain what it means to operationalize something. Okay, I'll run through some quick terms here with you. First is a variable. A variable is anything that can change or be different for different people. So if you had people in your study and some people had brown hair and some people had black hair, you could have some variable that you measured, which was hair color, and there would be two different options: brown hair, black hair. If the people are different ages, one's 90, the other one's 5, those are two things that are different or could be different for different people. So age could be a variable in your study. But if everybody was, these helicopters. Okay, it's gone now. All right. So as I was saying, um, variables, different things for different people. If everyone was exactly the same age, though, if everyone's 100, then you don't need age as a variable because it's not different for anybody in your study. So, how do you go about measuring a variable in the study is essentially going to be what I mean when I say operationalize it. So the example I like to use is, let's say you're doing a study on smoking. You want to determine, does smoking more increase your risk of cancer? And you want to define what you count as a single use of a cigarette. So, how would you measure that? If I, the person in your study that is smoking, if I light a cigarette, I take 2 puffs and put it out, does that count as 1? If I, person in your study, light the cigarette, smoke it until there's nothing left but the filter, and put it out, are those both 1 usage? Do chain smokers count the same as someone who is, taking longer puffs of the cigarette? How you go about determining what counts as smoking is going to be how you operationalize that variable. And I would imagine that you all can see there could be some difficulty in saying both of those examples I gave count as 1 use. So maybe you come up with something more elaborate. Maybe we're talking about the amount of smoke in their lungs over a certain amount of time. Well, then you got to figure out how you would actually get people to agree to, I don't know, allow you to put some kind of measuring device in their chest, or, put them in a situation where this was something you could take. You're taking it further away from the natural environment. Maybe you can't even smoke in such an environment with that kind of equipment because it would be some kind of hazard or something like that. You run into all kinds of problems. So the idea of trying to answer the question of can you truly love someone unless you love yourself, how do you operationalize love? What would it take for you to see an experiment to say, this is love for oneself? If somebody has this, possesses this, displays this, if we observe this in this study, we know for sure that person is someone who loves themselves. And we know that we can also track how they give that love to other people and whether they're able to do it or not, depending on the variable of does or does not love self. So please feel free, if you want to answer that question and you have some idea of what variables you would have in your study to prove what love is, how you operationalize love, I want to know. Because researchers have tried, and maybe I'll get into some of the research or that kind of stuff later, but it gets tricky. And to me, coming up with how you would operationalize something is some of the fun of research, because you do have to get creative in deciding, okay, listen, maybe we're going to look at how many puffs they take, and that's going to be how we determine cigarette usage. It may not be perfect, but it's something we can easily account for. 1 puff is 1 puff, regardless of how long they hold it. And that's just what we have to do. And maybe it's not the most precise measurement, but maybe it still gets you to the answer of your question of, do people who take more puffs end up with worse health problems? Maybe you get close enough to the answer. Maybe you get close enough to the truth. And maybe over time, after gathering the correlational research between, hey, look, we see people taking all these puffs, they aren't doing so great, you know, maybe there's a connection here. Maybe we come up with even more intense study to try and figure out. Maybe it was a fluke the first time. Maybe we just got lucky or unlucky and got a bunch of people who were going to get sick regardless of whether they smoked or not. And it has absolutely nothing to do with anything, and forget about it. It's perfectly healthy for you. That could have happened. So, like, let's try and replicate that and see if we can get more people together and figure out if we survey 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 20,000 people, do we continue to see the same patterns emerge in that more puffs lead to greater health risks? After seeing that connection time and time again, we can try and dig into that research more. And that is essentially how science carries out answering these things. And frankly, it can be a difficult experience, but it can also be pretty fun to have an idea, have a hypothesis, believe something to be true, and then to actually find evidence of it. Far too often we only look for evidence that confirms what we like to believe and kind of ignore stuff that disagrees with what our intuition says or what we thought to be true. That's some confirmation bias, another thing you all will read about. But that's another reason why we don't rely solely on intuition. Maybe this is something else people can fact check, because I do wonder how they figured this out. But I remember reading in undergrad how, one of our professors, Dr. Goldman, he was telling me about, I was in his class, he was telling me about how a social psychologist had essentially done some research on how if you want to figure out who's going to give you the most accurate account of things, you want someone that's slightly depressed, because happy people tend to want to hold on to their happiness in that moment and try and imagine things as being more pleasant than they are in order to maintain that illusion of happiness, whereas someone who is not so depressed that they are, just on the opposite end of the happiness scale of seeing everything is completely pessimistic and hopeless, but instead someone who's just, not super happy in the moment will give you a more accurate representation of events, because they have no desire to color it in any meaningful way. A more neutral observation may be the best way to put that. And while that, on face value, I could believe that, I do wonder, I didn't go digging into the research any further to be like, wow, let me go look that up. I just kind of accepted it, yeah, okay, that's kind of interesting, I also, when you look at the research on eyewitness testimony, you probably change your mind about how our legal system works in the U.S. I guarantee you, especially if you were the one on trial. Oh my, eyewitness testimony. In fact, a lot of forensic psychology, how they go about that science is interesting, and what comes about from it is even more so.
今からそなたに教えるのは水の瞑想だ。ここは森の中、目の前には滝がある。水の精霊よ、我々の血と肉の8割はそなたが司る水より作られている。水の精霊よ、そなたは何よりも謎めいた存在だ。液体の時もあれば氷の時もあり、雪の時もあれば蒸気や霧の時もある。癒しを与える時もあれば溺れさせる時もある。 我々の体と魂から病を、苦痛を、汚れを取り除き、害ある人々、社会、次元から害ある気を取り除きたまえ。若さ、知恵、知識、健康、強さ、喜び、幸せ、そして内なる安らぎを与えたまえ。水の精霊よ、我々に宿りたまえ。我々の血と肉になりたまえ。我々は水。滝から流れ落ちるのは我々自身だ。水の精霊よ、心と体と魂からの礼を申し上げる。そなたなしでは命は存在し得ない。そなたら四大元素が形作る美に敬意を表さん。
いなくなった。またなの？